Our speaker tonight is Greg Owen from Harrisonburg. He's a native of Harrisonburg, and he is going to talk to us about German prisoners of war in the Valley, and of course includes Shenandoah County during World War II. Greg is a historian, he's a researcher, he presents history programs throughout the state. He's author of 2 books, and we welcome him to come to Shenandoah County and tell us about prisoners of war. Thank you.
Thank you. It's great to see all these history lovers here this evening. It's gratifying. So let me test your knowledge of World War II history. What event happened 85 years ago today that was of national importance? No, 85 years ago today. September 16, 1940. The 15th was the main day of the Battle of Britain, and a lot of people say that was the day the battle was won. You were close. Absolutely. Congratulations. Yes. The Selective Service Act of 1940 was passed by Congress today. It was called the Burke-Wadsworth Act, and it was the first peacetime draft in U.S. history. And it's really interesting to read about the draft and about the American people in 1940 and the time leading up to the war. You know, we were isolationists by and large. After the Germans invaded Poland and then in early 1940 rolled through Western Europe, the American people, isolationist as they were, decided that something needed to be done, and they largely supported the peacetime draft with one caveat: they didn't want to be drafted. Okay. So there's the dichotomy there. We were still isolationists. People thought something needed to be done, but they did not want to be involved. American people did not want to be involved in World War II. We wanted neutrality. We wanted to have a peacetime draft to have an armed force stationed here in the U.S., not overseas in Europe or anywhere else. Okay, so I thought that was very important to mention today. By the way, the first draftee entered the service on November 18th then of 1940. Want to just say that 2025, 80 years after the end of World War II, you know, living memory of World War II is passing rapidly. And for that reason, we are going to talk about the prisoners of war in the Shenandoah Valley tonight, but we have to do so now, I feel is important, within the context of the war, so you can get a better idea of how the POW program that came to be implemented, that ultimately brought prisoners of war to the Shenandoah Valley, how that worked within the context of the war itself, okay? So with that, I want to say that tonight's presentation, I want to focus on 3 points, 3 main points. The U.S. encountered unprecedented crises during World War II, including severe shortages in the civilian labor force, massive numbers of prisoners of war captured in the European theater of operations, okay? Secondly, a wholly new and untested program was developed and implemented to resolve both of those crises simultaneously. And you may say, well, how does that work? Well, you'll find out here. And the third point is that This was a massive effort that required federal, state, and local government agencies by the bushel to work together and create a successful program to solve those two key crises that the U.S. faced. World War II, 1939 to 1945, we have to remember that was a total war situation. The United States and all of the warring countries were on a total war footing. 70 nations were engaged in combat in 3 continents and on the world's oceans. 21 to 25 million military deaths were suffered, along with 50 to 55 million civilian deaths. And in cost, in today's dollars, the U.S. cost was $4 trillion. And yes, it was the most significant event of the 20th century. You probably have parents, other people who were alive during the war. No one here was alive during the war, right? You're all baby boomers? Oh, you were, ma'am. Okay. How many times have you heard people say, or maybe you even said in talking with others, before the war, after the war, right? Society, American society, was vastly changed due to the war. In Rome? Really? Whoa. Wow. That is amazing. Well, you should come up here and talk about your experiences instead of me. But indeed, the American society was changed forever due to the war and the stresses and the requirements and everything that went together with an operating society in a total war setting, to the extent that virtually everything we experience today has some tentacle back to the war, as far as technology development, as far as country boundaries, you name it. Virtually everything changed because of World War II. The civilian labor crisis in the U.S. Here's some numbers. U.S. population in 1941 was 133,400,000. That's an estimate. 17,867,000 Americans were inducted into the armed forces in 1941 to 45. 11,535,000 were draftees. 6,332,000 were enlistees. In the U.S. at large, and interestingly enough, in Virginia alone, both 11.2% of the populations served in the armed forces at some time during World War II. And because of that, those massive numbers of people who were taken out of the civilian labor force, by and large, those draftees and enlistees, that created a massive, a severe civilian labor shortage. The greatest military-industrial effort in history was compounded by the civilian labor needs. Take a look here at these numbers. U.S. civilian workforce in 1940 was 54,500,000. 24 million people were in the U.S. workforce in war production alone during the war. Now, that means the war factories, okay, primarily. And of that 24 million, by the way, 5 million were women. A total of, interestingly enough here, remember we said about 17 million Americans were serving in uniform during the war. Almost the same number, 16 million women left the home and went into the workforce, including, from that 16 million, 5 million women who went into the war factories. And interestingly enough, you see the war plants produced 2 million military trucks, 300,000 aircraft, of which many of those aircraft were built almost entirely by women. Now, they had male supervisors, but the women themselves were the actual production people. They were the riveters, you know, they were the people who put the things together. Also created 193,000 artillery pieces and 86,000 tanks. Remember, the U.S. was the arsenal of democracy. So not only was this equipment used by the Americans, but it was provided to the British, to the French, to the Russians, okay? And we fulfilled that moniker, being the arsenal of democracy. At roughly the same time, starting in November 1942, the Allied forces began invading first North Africa and then going through the soft underbelly of Europe, invading Sicily and Italy and ultimately France and ultimately Germany. At each point, they started capturing large numbers of prisoners of war, German and Italian, okay? Now, the first POWs that came to the U.S. were captured actually by the British. They were being held by the British, captured in North Africa, and the British couldn't handle caring for, maintaining those prisoners of war. So they asked the U.S. if we would take them, and the U.S. said, yeah, we'll do that for you. So having said that, there was never enough Allied resources in the European theater of operations to care and hold these overwhelming numbers of POWs. We had so many resources that we had shipped over to the combat areas in Europe, and yet the need was so great that we absolutely didn't have the manpower and the supplies and the facilities to guard and to clothe and house and feed prisoners of war. And it was imperative to make sure those POWs were not repatriated by their own armies somehow. So what to do? Well, someone in the U.S. had a brilliant idea. And we'll get to that. The U.S. government responded to the overwhelming need then for the civilian labor crisis and the POW crisis by coming up with a program that had no precedent in U.S. history. In World War I, we had only captured a couple hundred German Navy people, so there was no precedent there. The Civil War, yeah, we had tons of prisoners of war, but they were our guys. So that was not a precedent. So the government found itself unable to look back into our history to determine how to deal with large numbers of POWs. And so a number of agencies got together and collaborated to come up with a comprehensive program to do that. And look at all the agencies of the government and federal, state, local that were involved in this program that ultimately solved the civilian work labor crisis and the POW issue. The U.S. Army, known then as the Department of War. The Navy Department had its own department. So there was War Department for Army, Navy Department for Navy. So under the Army, the Joint Chiefs of Staff, well, you can see here, the Army Service Force service commands that operated bases all through the U.S., the Provost Marshal General's Office, which provided the administrative arm of the ultimate program that was developed, Judge Advocate General's office, because every decision had to be passed through legal channels, and the Military Police Corps, of course, to provide guards, not only the War Department, but the U.S. State Department, U.S. Department of Justice, Department of Agriculture, War Manpower Commission, Employment Service, War Foods Administration, state and local USDA Extension Services, and state and local employment services. It's amazing how so many organizations had to work together to come up with a comprehensive program to solve these labor and POW issues. What came about as a result of all of that? And by the way, this comprehensive program that ultimately was developed, it didn't work like a charm, okay? It would make 2 steps forward, 1 back, 2 forward, 1 back, constantly, until by the end of the war, it had actually started to work quite well. But it worked on 3 fundamental principles. Number 1, transport all enemy POWs to prison camps in the U.S. Now, how many people knew that masses of German prisoners came to the U.S. during World War II? Yeah, it was not a secret. Everybody knew, okay? But it was quite an amazing thing. And on the surface, you say, well, how would that possibly work? Remember the arsenal of democracy? We were shipping resources, equipment, manpower across the Atlantic from the U.S. on hundreds, thousands of ships, okay? And they were coming back empty. So someone had the bright idea, put the German prisoners and the Italian prisoners on ships, on the empty transports, bring them back here, which is what happened. Now, interestingly enough, the German prisoners that I've talked to said that their main fear as POWs, by and large, was on the transportation run from the European theater to the U.S. They were afraid their own U-boats were going to sink the ships that they were on. But interestingly enough, a lot of the ships that the POWs came over on were ocean liners. And the ocean liners, what were they armed with? One thing, speed. Absolutely. They could outrun a torpedo. Yeah. So anyway, so great idea. Transport all the POWs over here where we had more than enough resources to house, feed, clothe, and guard prisoners of war in massive numbers. The prisoners then would help solve the civilian labor crisis by being used as a labor force. Now, according to the Geneva Convention of 1929, which you see here, the program mandated that the rules of the Geneva Convention of 1929 would be followed to the letter as far as the treatment of prisoners was concerned. Why would we care so much about treating the POWs according to the rules of the Geneva Convention? Absolutely. Yep. We did not want to give Hitler any excuse for treating our prisoners badly as a result of some news report that might filter back to Germany saying that prisoners had been mistreated. Yank magazine, the Sad Sack, which happened to be the most popular part of the Soldiers magazine, shows exactly the sentiment of the American GI in the combat zones. Sack runs into a German soldier. He knocks the German out, takes him to a POW camp in Europe, and is making fun of him, and then the German turns around and says, "To be shipped to the USA." And Sad Sack, who was known for having the worst luck of any soldier, in the army, he walks away disgusted because that's all the guys overseas wanted. They wanted to be back here, and yet the German prisoners were going to get here before they did. So look at the progression of POWs in the U.S. May 1943 was when the POWs started to really flow into the U.S. These guys were captured in North Africa, okay? Now, the thing about the guys captured in 1943 was Germany was still on its ascendancy, even though they had started to suffer terribly with losses in the Russian war on the Eastern Front. These guys from the Africa Corps were captured thinking that, well, Germany's still going to win the war. I might be captured, but we're going to win. By the time you get down to May 1945, when there were 425,871 prisoners here in the U.S., the Germans who were here had no illusions that Germany was going to win the war at all. They knew the war was lost. And the difference was the Africa Corps guys, they typically were arrogant, and they didn't, they were good workers, but they would still be very reticent, okay? Not as cooperative as what the later prisoners turned out to be, because by the time the masses of prisoners were here, everyone knew in their hearts, every POW knew in his heart that Germany was going to lose the war. Now, of that 425,871, notice that there were 50,273 Italian prisoners. Now, this is important because the Italians were POWs when they came over here, but when Italy surrendered to the Allies after the invasion of Sicily in July 1943 and became a co-belligerent against Germany, the Italians were reclassified because they were no longer enemies. The Italian prisoners were reclassified as internees, and that name change, that designation, meant great things to the Italians, because the Italians were then, as internees, organized into what were called Italian service units. They wore American uniforms. They were paid the same rate as an American private would be paid, okay, each month. And they were allowed to work directly in military facilities, for the war effort, okay? The German POWs remained POWs, and so their benefits from being over here were much less than what the Italians, I don't want to say enjoyed, but yeah, in a way they sort of, they had a lot of freedom, okay? They were still vaguely guarded, okay? But, yes, yeah, but not these guys. I'll tell you about that. Yeah. But anyway, the Italians, they were an interesting group, and with the American uniforms they wore, they had a big patch that said Italy on it, and they were glad to be internees and not POWs. Now, notice the small number of Japanese prisoners, 3,915, were brought to the U.S. Why so few?
Either they didn't surrender or we didn't let them surrender.
Yeah, exactly. Exactly. Yep. So, you have all these prisoners of war here in the U.S. They were housed or confined in 44 states of the Union, okay? 44 of the 48 states. 115 base camps were established. Those base camps were like Camp Pickett, Virginia, okay? A permanent U.S. Army base, large base, and a portion of Camp Pickett was fenced off to make a POW compound where about 4,000, in the case of Camp Pickett, 4,000 prisoners were held, and those prisoners then were doled out as labor needs were approved for prisoners of war to be transferred to local branch camps from Camp Pickett. So in all 115 base camps, that same process took place, okay? What we're going to talk about with the prisoners of war in the Shenandoah Valley, the experience here with POWs was the microcosm of the POW experience in the country at large, okay? Very little difference, only a matter of location. So there were 511 regional branch camps located in individual communities across 44 states with a local population of about 150 to 750. The branch camps were temporary facilities. Temporary, you'll see a little bit later, has a couple of different meanings. You'll see the difference. And those branch camps provided POW labor for the mainly rural areas like Rockingham County, Augusta County, some Shenandoah County, okay? So that's the structure of the POW camp system. Now, how is it that a branch camp would be established? Well, there was an established process that was required. Local employers, farmers, factory owners, business people, they would get together and meet with the local USDA farm extension agent who, excuse me, would head up the program to establish what was called a certification of need that stated that no other source of civilian labor is available or was available, and that German prisoners of war were needed to fill a severe local labor crisis. So once that certification of need was sent to the War Manpower Commission and got approved, then a branch camp was located in a local area where prisoners would be sent from, in our case, Camp Pickett, to the local POW camp, and then farmers, businessmen, factory owners, what have you, orchardists would apply for an allotment of prisoners to work for them. POW program obstacles, and there were plenty. Number one, when people found out POWs were coming to their area, there indeed was a lot of initial fear and resentment. The idea was that these monsters from Germany who were captured, these Nazis, they are going to be brought here and they're going to escape and they're going to run rampant across the country and assault the women and blow up, anything that they can find to destroy and so forth. Didn't pan out that way, but there indeed was an absolute fear of the Germans being brought into a local area. And also there was resentment. And I have information on a woman in Rockingham County, a farm wife, who said the toughest thing that she had to endure was seeing German prisoners on their farm after her son was killed by the Germans. You know, I mean, those were real things, real events that happened. I mean, think about that. But ultimately, once the prisoners were here, the closer the prisoners were to the local people, the local population, they began to see, well, these prisoners, they're pretty good workers. You know, they're actually doing a lot of good for us. And ultimately, there was primarily or largely an acceptance of the prisoners being here. When I say here, I mean not only this area, but the nation at large. And of course, acceptance led to fraternization. It was strictly prohibited that any American civilian should have any contact with a prisoner of war, even though they're working on your farm, you know, or working in your plant. You were not supposed to have any contact with them other than to give them instructions. Okay? Well, that soon went by the wayside. The labor unions were vehemently opposed to prisoner of war laborers coming in and stealing union jobs. Well, that never happened anyway, but the labor unions wanted assurances that it was not going to be a problem, and so ultimately that was all worked out. So what the POW camp establishment had as an issue then was whether, well, see here, we have a security first mandate and a labor first mandate. The security first mandate meant that there would be guards sent out with every group of prisoners, okay, wherever the prisoners were working. But the problem was there were never enough guards. So the only other alternative was a labor first mandate, meaning that more employers of POW labor could use prisoners, you know, in their farms, factories, whatever, but they couldn't be guarded because, again, not enough guards. So what ultimately happened was, once it was discovered that, well, most prisoners weren't going to cause any harm or try to escape or anything, it was decided that the labor first mandate was the route to go. So the prisoners that we will talk about in Rockingham County and Augusta County, you'll learn most of those were not guarded. Okay, which is interesting. You think, oh, every POW, who's out in a field, certainly there's got to be someone guarding him to make sure he doesn't run off. Nah, they weren't guarded. Another concern was POW escapes. A big problem, the biggest problem with the POW program that the Army faced was they regrettably made German non-commissioned officers in charge of the enlisted prisoners. They thought that would be the best way to control the enlisted men, the larger groups of enlisted men. But the problem was a lot of NCOs were Nazis, okay? And they wielded mad discipline in too many cases. And ultimately, they were segregated. The Nazis were shipped out. But anyway, it was I think the greatest fault of the program was that the Army let Nazi NCOs be in charge of POW enlisted men. POW deaths occurred. Of course, with 425,000, some of them are going to die. We'll show you in a minute how few. And then the last problem here, irredeemable Nazi POWs. About 5,000 POWs were so vile that they could never be used as a labor force. Members of the Gestapo, the SS, Okay, spies, saboteurs. Don't use those people. Don't send them out on the farm. So, as for escapes, there were 2,222 POWs who escaped American captivity in the U.S. during the war, one of which actually was from Timberville POW camp. His name was Kirk Crott, and he was an 18-year-old kid, weighed 107 pounds, and decided to walk away from the camp at Timberville. And he was on the run about 14 hours or so. And he said later that he wasn't trying to get away. He was homesick. He just wanted to go and get away from the camp. And so he was nearby. And the sheriff's department called got together, with all the local authorities, and they had this massive manhunt for him. And WSVA radio in Harrisonburg had constant reports on, alerting people that this prisoner had escaped. And ultimately, he was recaptured, and or he gave himself up. The stories vary, but anyway, he was shipped back to Camp Pickett and probably spent 2 weeks in solitary or something like that, But interestingly enough, of the 2,222 escapes that took place in 1947, when the last of the POWs had been shipped overseas back to their home countries, 17 German escapees were still on the run, okay? The last to give himself up was Georg Gertner, who was on the FBI 10 Most Wanted list for years. He finally gave himself up in 1984 to Bryant Gumbel on the Today Show. He had escaped from a POW camp in New Mexico, got down through Mexico, ultimately went to Hawaii and lived a life there, did construction work, and was a semi-pro tennis player, and married, and ultimately made his way across, out of Hawaii back to the continental U.S., and ultimately set up housekeeping in a Chicago suburb. And interestingly enough, his wife didn't even know he was an escaped POW. And when he gave himself up in 1984, she was so distraught by the whole process, she divorced him. Yeah. So. Really? Wow. How about that? Yeah, that's amazing. Speaking of that, during the war now, I cannot prove the veracity of this, okay? But I'm just relating this story to you that made its rounds during the war, that 4 Germans escaped from Camp Crossville, Tennessee. By the way, Sergeant York was from Crossville, Tennessee. Well, anyway, the 4 prisoners escaped from Camp Crossville, and they made their way up into the high mountains and came upon this homestead of a very elderly woman. And she heard these noises and went out on her front porch and saw these strange men, walking around and crouching, and they were on her land. That's all she knew. And so she yells for them to get, and they don't get. So she goes in to her mantelpiece and takes her shotgun down off the mantelpiece and goes back out to the front porch and pumps them full of birdshot. And that creates all kind of a commotion, and somebody found out that this situation was going on. They called the sheriff, who came and collected up the prisoners and was interviewing the woman. He said, "Granny, why did you shoot those German boys?" And she said, "I didn't know they were Germans. I thought they were Yankees." Here again, I can't prove that, but that's the story. There were 491 POW deaths from those who were confined here. 7 murders committed by POWs. 40 were shot and killed during escapes or were murdered by American civilians. It happened a few times. 72 of the suicides, probably many of those were actually murders that were created or were committed rather by these Nazi NCOs of recalcitrant men or anyone that they overheard making any comments that sounded like they were supporting the surrender of Germany or what have you. 93 were killed during work accidents or vehicle crashes, 265 by natural causes, and 14 were executed by the U.S. Army for murders that they committed as overseers of the POW enlisted men. The die-hard Nazis were ultimately segregated and sent to Camp Alva, Oklahoma. And there they just sat out in that desolate, dreary place, according to one who knows Camp Alva very well. And again, they were members of the SS, Gestapo, spies, saboteurs that could never be used as POW labor. POWs in the Shenandoah Valley. It took a while to get here, didn't it? Okay. There were 35 base and branch camps in Virginia, 4 POW and internment camps in the Shenandoah Valley. Ingleside Hotel, Shenandoah and Newmarket, Camp Timberville, and Camp Lyndhurst. The 2 camps were prisoner of war camps. Ingleside and the Shenandoah were not POW camps. They were internment facilities, okay, for enemy diplomats. Now, the Ingleside Hotel first held both German and Italian diplomats captured in North Africa. And after the surrender of the Italians to the Allies after the invasion of Sicily, it was decided that we better separate the diplomats so they don't cause any problem amongst themselves. And by the way, there were also some wives included in the internees. At least one baby was born to a German family of diplomats in the Ingleside. So the Shenandoah, here's what happened. One day in November of 1943, Charlotte Miller was at her counter in the lobby of the Shenandoah Hotel, and a man in a very nicely cut suit comes in and flashes a badge and says, "I'm with the U.S. State Department. We're taking over your hotel." And that was that. And shortly thereafter, 19 Italian diplomats were brought into the Shenandoah. And by all accounts, some of these diplomats were very young and extremely handsome. And how can I say this? The women of Newmarket went wild. I gave this talk to the Historical Society in Newmarket some years ago, and this one veteran of the war said, yeah, while we were overseas fighting, our women were over here cavorting with these Italian diplomats. I mean, he was still angry about it. Yeah. Now, Jacob Saylor was a 14-year-old boy who worked at the Shenandoah, and he said to me, he said, I could not define the word fraternization, but I sure knew it when I saw it on the back nine of the golf course. The ladies found a way. Now, the Italians, they had the run of the Shenandoah. They played tennis, they played golf. They were allowed off of the property several times a week to walk downtown into New Market. They were guarded, okay, but apparently they were guarded to keep the women away from them. Yeah, there were a total of 8 guards and 1 German Shepherd. And so the Italians, needless to say, were quite well accepted by by some of the people of New Market at least. Okay. Rockingham County, well, the entire Shenandoah Valley suffered as it was across the country, a severe labor crisis. And the harvest of 1944, almost universally in the Shenandoah Valley, were bumper crops. And so what to do when 11.2% of the manpower is in uniform? Well, different state agencies got together and invited men who were not accepted for military service, 4Fs, to work in the fields and the farms and the factories and the orchards, conscientious objectors from local camps. By the way, the local conscientious objector camps, there was one in Grottoes and there was one in Lyndhurst, Virginia, that were run by the Civilian Public Service Program that was headed by the Church of the Brethren and the Mennonites. And most of the people who were CPS boys were actually from that denomination. Here's an interesting aside. There were no more than 42,000 men who registered as conscientious objectors during World War II. Amazingly small number. A number of those guys were Jehovah's Witnesses. Jehovah's Witnesses at that time were not recognized as a religious organization by the U.S. government. So when these Jehovah's Witnesses declared their CO status, they were not accepted, and those guys went to prison. Okay? Most of the, and then there were 12,000, primarily Mennonite and Brethren, CPS boys, okay? The remainder actually served in the military in non-combat roles. So they were conscientious objectors, but they still served. You've probably seen the movie about Desmond Doss, the Medal of Honor winner. It was said he was a conscientious objector. He was never a conscientious objector. He was a Virginian, by the way. He said himself, I was a conscientious cooperator. He never intended not to serve in the Army or face combat. He just didn't want to kill anybody. And so to label him as a CO is incorrect. So anyway, finding people to help bring in the harvest in the Shenandoah Valley included also members of the U.S. Women's Land Army. That was a voluntary organization made up mainly of college students, girls, young women, and another organization, Victory Farm Boys and Girls from the cities, Boy Scouts and Girl Scouts, local high school and college students, and federal employees given time off to come to the valley and help bring in the harvest, and state prison convicts. And yet, with all that, there still was not enough labor. So local businessmen and farmers and so forth got together in Rockingham County and met with county agent, extension agent Frederick Holsinger, and discussed the process of getting a POW camp established in Rockingham County. And ultimately, they did provide the certification of need, and that certification of need was accepted by the War Manpower Commission, and ultimately, prisoners of war came to Rockingham County 3 miles west of the town of Timberville on Orchard Drive on the land owned by Herman Holler, who voluntarily donated his field for a POW camp to be built. It was a temporary camp, and you'll see it in a minute, temporary camp that was intended to be used for 3 months during the 1944 harvest season, and ultimately it was used in the 1945 harvest season as well. So the first prisoners came on August 1st, and the people in the town of Timberville en masse stood on their front porches and watched as this convoy of U.S. Army trucks drove through Main Street, south to north, and everybody was watching, looking at the prisoners who were on the backs of those trucks. And one of the prisoners said to the guy sitting beside of him, "They're looking to see if we have horns." And so the camp was established on the Holler property. Now, the next farm over was owned by the May family. Young Ben and Joe May all summer had been anticipating this day. Their father had told him every day, "You boys stay away from there. Those men are dangerous." But like young boys, they had totally ignored their father and every day went to the hillside overlooking where this camp was being built, okay, by prisoners. And they saw their first German prisoners of war. And Ben May said, "We thought they were going to be monsters. Instead, they were 16-year-old kids." They were so disappointed. You know, they wanted to see these monsters being herded around. But that was the beginning of the POW camp in Rockingham County. And this is the only known photograph of that camp. Now, notice something very important here. On the left side of the camp, or of the picture there, these are tents, okay? Here's a guard tower right there, and the fence. There's a rectangular layout. And to the right here, these tents all belong to the U.S. Army administrators and the guards for the camp. Now, this shows something very important. According to the Geneva Convention of 1929, the food, housing, clothing that was provided for the prisoners had to be of equal quality to what the American guards had. And so, because the prisoners slept in tents, the guards slept in tents. Okay? And even though, as far as food is concerned, the prisoners fixed their own meals. They were provided the food. They fixed their own. And, of course, the guards, they fixed their own. They did not get together and have meals or anything. But this does show quite clearly how the rules of the Geneva Convention were followed. And that's quite a nice picture. I just wish that there were others available. Rockingham County during World War II, you wouldn't know it today, but it was critically important because of its poultry, fruit, and vegetable production, critically important to global military and civilian consumption. 1944, 350 train car loads of canned products were sent out. A lot of that produced by prisoners of war, okay? 1945, which was not a bumper crop year, 280 train cars. The POWs performed 30,375 man-days of labor during those 2-3-month harvest seasons. The POW camp in Timberville had an average population of 175. The populations changed as the needs arose for more or fewer prisoners for labor purposes, okay? They primarily, from Timberville, were used on farms and orchards, factory labor. And here's another critically important part of the Geneva Convention of 1929. The POWs were paid a daily labor, well, the Army was paid a daily labor rate commensurate with what the current labor rate was for Rockingham County, which was $2.85 a day, okay? The Army got $2.85 a day for every prisoner that was working, okay? The prisoner got 85 cents of that $2.85. The other $2 was used to offset the operation of the camp and so forth. The 85 cents could be used, it was actually given to the prisoners in scrip. They would never give them real money, you know, in case they would try to escape. Well, they'd have some money on their persons. So they would have scrip that they could use to buy candy, cigarettes, and such, you know, at the small canteen that they had at Camp Timberville. The money that was not used by the prisoners was accumulated in a savings account for that prisoner. And this was true for every single German POW held in the U.S. A savings account was set up for them, and 85 cents a day went into their account unless they requested some money, again, for spending. And when the prisoners were repatriated in 1946 back to Germany, they each had in hand a check from the local bank for the amount of money in their savings account. And that money, in some cases, actually prevented starvation from occurring, because, I mean, Germany in 1946 was a devastated country, and it was difficult to find anything to eat. Well, if you could find something, you better have something to trade for it. You know, and money was so valuable for survival. And so these repatriated prisoners, yeah, they lived on this money that they earned here as POWs. The main employers in Rockingham County were the Ziegler Cannery, Rockingham Poultry Co-op, Mutual Cold Storage, H.E. Mason Sawmill, Rocco, City Produce Exchange, Tip Top Fruit Farm. Notice all of those, except for the sawmill, are food production facilities. And then, of course, Harrisonburg Junk and Hide. I always wondered, oh my gosh, you know, most of you probably don't remember Harrisonburg back in, 50 years ago or so. But Harrisonburg Junk and Hide was a depressing, ramshackle place. I can't imagine prisoners actually working there. And in fact, the owner was Jewish, so I don't know how well they got along. But interestingly enough, the prisoners who worked in Harrisonburg, they were put on an army truck and sent to the Greyhound bus station in Harrisonburg every day, and picked up at the bus station in the afternoon. It was the responsibility otherwise for a farmer, let's say, who wanted to have a POW work on his farm, help bring in the harvest. However many POWs he needed, he would go to the sergeant of the guard, in this case at Camp Timberville, and say, I need 4 prisoners today. And sergeant of the guard would take his name and his request and check his roster and then get approval from the camp commander, and then would say, okay, you got 4 prisoners. And it was the responsibility then for the employer to pack those prisoners in his truck or car, take them out to his farm, unguarded. He was responsible for them until he brought them back. And they would be given a small amount of food for lunch. And oftentimes the food ration they were given for lunch was not adequate. So, you know what happened? Remember we talked about fraternization a while ago? Many of these farmers wound up ultimately having the prisoners eat lunch in the kitchen with them. Absolutely forbidden by the Army. Absolutely forbidden, but it was done almost universally because, smart thinking. The prisoners thought, well, the better I work for this farmer, the nicer he's going to treat me. And the farmer at the same time said, the better I treat this prisoner, the better he's going to work for me. So a mutual understanding developed that worked quite well. And so that's the modus operandi. Yeah.
Did the prisoners at the Shenandoah do any work?
No, they were not required to do anything because they were diplomats.
Were they paid?
No, no, they were diplomats. So they weren't expected to work, nor were officer prisoners of war. Officers could not be compelled to work according to the Geneva Convention. Yep. So only enlisted men, and non-commissioned officers could only be used as prisoner and labor in a supervisory capacity. Okay, so yeah, poor enlisted man, the privates and the corporals. Oh yeah, oh yeah, yeah. The State Department picked up the tab for everything. Oh yeah. Now, that brings up a good point. The diplomats were very well taken care of. Okay? Why? Well, again, our diplomats were being held by the Germans, okay, and by the Italians. Last thing we wanted was for any problem to crop up that would cause animosity and bad news to get back overseas, to Mussolini or Hitler. And that brings up another story. Who knows who the Secretary of State was during World War II? Yes. Who was his wife? Louise Witz from Stanton, Virginia. Yeah. And one day, somebody noticed that the Ingleside's flagpole had no American flag on it. And they asked somebody, where's the flag? And they were told it was taken down for cleaning. Well, it never got put back up. So finally, somebody asked Louise, hey, what's going on here? Find out with your husband. And so her husband, Cordell, said, look, we don't want our diplomats having to salute the Nazi flag, while they're being held in Germany. So we're not putting up the American flag to give the German diplomats any reason to think that we're making them salute the American flag. So there you have it. Yeah.
Did any stay here in the U.S.?
Only the escaped POWs who hadn't been captured. They had to be shipped back to their home countries. Yeah. Yeah. A lot of people say, well, how many stayed? None except for the escapees. Yeah. Yes, starting in 1951, they were about 5,000. That's an estimate, but about 5,000 came back under the auspices of the U.S. State Department through regular immigration processes. They were not allowed to come back until that time. Yeah. Here's a POW index card for Herbert Vogt, who was a POW at Camp Timberville. And there's Herbert Vogt. captured in Normandy. He was a bank teller in his hometown in Bamberg, Germany, and was sent to Camp Pickett, ultimately to Camp Timberville, and he worked at the Mason's sawmill, and he had nothing but good to say about his imprisonment as a POW in Rockingham County. He's not saying, he didn't say that it was overly pleasant, okay, but he said it was correct, okay? So you get the point, I mean, he was a prisoner of war, come on, he was behind the fence. But interestingly enough, when he was repatriated back to Germany, he got his old job back and retired as chairman of the board of that bank where he had first worked as a bank teller. And there's the campsite today, where 3 miles west of Timberville. If you go to the property, the only thing that you can really see is where some sewage lines ran. There's some concrete bases there, and some flat concrete surfaces where tents were placed over top of those. As a matter of fact, that corn crib is sitting on one of them. The other local or Shenandoah Valley POW camp was Camp Lyndhurst in Augusta County, close to Shenandoah Lake. Now, notice how permanent this camp looks. This camp was operated as a POW camp for 17 months straight and was a former CCC camp, okay? And before, well, here's the history of it. CCC camp, and then when the CCC was disbanded in 1942, it became a CPS camp for conscientious objectors operated by the Church of the Brethren. And then after the CO contingent was moved to Bedford, Virginia, to a CPS camp, then the camp was empty for a bit until it was chosen as a site for the Augusta County Prisoner of War Camp. And it was the CCC camps were the perfect place to have a POW camp because the buildings were solid, they were permanent in nature. All the camp had to do to become a POW camp was, or the Army, they just put up the barbed wire, 8-foot barbed wire fence and the guard towers, and they were good to go. So, no, they were their own administration. Yeah. Yeah, they were one of the alphabet agencies. Yeah, they stood on their own, which, as you might know, Phil, CCC was the most successful of the alphabet agencies that were organized to fight the Great Depression. Yeah. Here's a schematic of the much more complex CCC or Camp Lyndhurst POW camp. To the left, the vertical bars, they represent the barracks where the prisoners would stay, were confined, and the fence was around those barracks. And the rest of the area was used by the Army for its purposes. The camp was commanded by a tough-as-nails little Italian guy named William Calafiera, Captain Calafiera, who had been assigned to one of the ISU, Italian service units, and he, being of Italian extraction, spoke fluent Italian. He loved his position, and he was yanked out of that position and sent to command the CCC or the POW camp at Lyndhurst. and arrived on April 13th, 1945, which happened to be another keynote day. What happened on April 13th, 1945? Nope. Yep, Roosevelt died. Roosevelt died, yeah. And he despised commanding a German POW camp. I contacted him, this is many years ago, and could not get him to cooperate with me in any way, shape, or form. Unfortunately, he said he had a bunch of photographs, but he wasn't inclined to share them with me. So, what are you going to do? So anyway, this camp operated 17 months as a POW camp. And Augusta County in the World War II years was, you wouldn't even recognize it. If you go to Augusta County today, at the time there were 17,000 acres of orchards, apple orchards, 440,000 apple trees, and in 44 produced 2 million bushels of apples. The POWs performed 43,000 man days of labor during 17 continuous months. Average population 250. Most of the people worked in timber, pulpwood harvesting. That's what I'm trying to say. But a number also worked on local farms and the orchards, and also at the Woodrow Wilson Army Hospital, which is now, by the way, Woodrow Wilson Rehab. The facility is still there. The Augusta County day rate was $3.50, but still, prisoners got 85 cents a day. Okay. One of the prisoners there was Carl Bauman, and when I started doing research back in the 90s on the POW program in the Shenandoah Valley, I had a client in my office one day. I was a trust officer in Stanton at a bank, and happened to mention to this guy who lived in Lyndhurst, I said, "Did you know there was a POW camp?" And he said, "Yeah, the father of one of my guys that I work with was a POW there." I said, "Whoa, what's his name? I want to talk to him." So I got the guy's name, called him up, and he did not want to be interviewed. Okay, his wife answered the phone actually, and she said, "My husband doesn't want to talk to you, but I'll give you the name of someone who will. Carl Bauman, he will talk to you." Well, Carl Bauman, as did this other prisoner, came back to the U.S. in 1951 and set up housekeeping within 10 miles of the POW camp where they were held as prisoners during the war. And so I contacted Carl, and boy, did I hit a gold mine. As a matter of fact, that began a relationship that led to my book, The Longest Patrol, The U-Boat Gunners' War. Carl was a fabulous person to relate his experiences because he was extremely intelligent, spoke English fluently, which he taught himself, by the way, as a prisoner of war. And he would tell me about some incident and or some event in his life, and his wife, Annalisa, would shortly come out of the bedroom with a document that was the empirical evidence of what he was telling me. And I said, "Whoa, this is extraordinary." I spent hundreds and hundreds of hours with Carl over the years. And of course, Carl and Annalisa have both passed on. But he was just a fabulous person to relate his experiences. And the most frustrating thing, by the way, I don't want to deviate too much, that I had with Carl was he he would give me some information, and I would think, okay, is this all he has to tell me? And one day I said, Carl, is there anything else that you haven't told me? And he chuckled and he said, there's so much more. But you have to ask the right questions. And then it wasn't too long that he passed. And I regret to this day that how come I didn't ask some of the right questions. But that's life as a historian. Yes, sir.
I don't know how many more slides you have.
Just a couple.
I'll wait. Thank you.
Okay. This is Camp Lyndhurst today. This, of course, the CCC camp, was built on National Forest land. And in 2014, by the way, when I shot this picture, of course, the camp had been overgrown for decades. And a film crew followed me to the campsite, and we plotted out where the camp was, found the layouts of where the barracks were and everything, and marked them with surveyors' pins and everything. And Forest Service came along and pulled everything up. They did not want people going there and visiting the campsite. Well, for one thing, there used to be telephone poles, and the fence posts and everything. The poles and everything, they were just pulled up, and the holes remained. Well, they were full of leaves, and we'd be walking along and step down into one, so you could easily break a leg. But also, and the prisoners of war at Camp Lyndhurst were very aware of this and petrified of the rattlesnakes in summer. So Forest Service doesn't want anybody going there. And so that's unfortunately what the camp looks like today with none of my markings. Okay, here's the final accounting for the POW program as a labor force nationwide. In May 1945, 91.3% of all POWs available for labor actually were employed. It was impossible to fill all requests for POW labor. And during their time here, they provided 851,994 man-months of labor. And you can see the breakdown there, 439,000 in agricultural work, 165,000 in pulpwood lumber harvesting, 110,000 food processing, and 50,000 in public works and sewer line construction and such. Okay. So, in sum, the success of the POW program far outweighed security risks. Civilian and military fear and hostility toward POW labor was overcome. Threats never materialized. POWs successfully offset critical manpower shortage essential to the U.S. economy and war effort. The U.S. Army paid out $274,771 to the POWs for their work, and it alleviated the risk and logistics required to confine nearly 500,000 POWs in the European combat theater. And just as a final bit of information, if you are interested in going to the Massanutten Regional Library branch offices, there's one in, I think there's one in Timberville. And the Historical Society in Timberville has my book, Wehrmacht Autumns, and this is my compiled research material for the Camp Timberville. And, of course, the Library of Virginia has a copy of it. And so I mentioned that to you in case you want to do some further reading. And then my book is available on Amazon.com. That's the easiest way to get it. And I think it's a good read. Now, I will open up the floor to any questions that you might have whatsoever. Yes, sir.
First, thank you. An observation, at least 96% of the material you presented tonight to me, who had a father who served in World War II and a pretty avid historian, is new. So, congratulations for that.
Well, thank you.
But now, as a Navy veteran, I would request, if not almost insist, that your war production slide include naval vessels.
Well, that's true. Yeah, absolutely true. Yeah, that definitely is an oversight, and I will fix that. Yeah, and the goal was an 800 ship Navy. You know, when war started, we only had the Pacific Fleet and the Atlantic Squadron, okay? And so the government put forth a program to spend, forget how many billions of dollars on building an 800 ship Navy, but they did not anticipate that that 800 ship number would be met until 1947.
Well, they did almost 1,200 combatants.
Yeah. Sure. Yes.
Did the farmers and the business owners that hired the POWs have to pay anything?
Well, yeah, the question, did the employers of POW labor have to pay anything? Yeah, they were the ones who paid the Army the $2.85 a day in Rockingham County and $3.50 a day per POW that they had in their employ. Yeah. Yep. Indeed. Yes.
We adhered to the Geneva Convention. Did the other countries do that?
The Japanese didn't. The Germans did. Interestingly enough, the question is, did the Germans, did the enemy abide by the Geneva Convention? Yes, they did, with the exception of Japan, which did not recognize the Geneva Convention. And when it comes to the Russians, the Soviets, they did not recognize it for German prisoners. Okay? And the Germans didn't recognize the Russians either. Well, that is true. And where those prisoners, there were likely air crew who were shot down. And when there's at least one instance where a German Luftwaffe officer was at a concentration camp, and these POW... Exactly. Yeah. These American prisoners saw he was Luftwaffe, and appealed to him to get them moved to a Luftwaffe POW camp, and the guy did. Yeah.
Any other questions, if you don't mind? It's just gotten long.
Okay. Were there
You
any
can ask individually.
Were there any prisoner exchanges?
No. No.
Okay, thank you so much.
Certainly.